Thanks to everybody for coming this morning and taking time out of your busy schedule to come over to CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies. We'll get started right away. I wanted to introduce my colleagues. To my immediate left is Jennifer Cook, who is the co-director of our Africa program. And further down the line is Dr. Steve Morrison, who's the director of our Africa program and also the head of our HIV/AIDS task force. And without further ado, I will pass it to Jennifer.
Great. Thanks very much and welcome. And I'm very envious of you all being able to go on this trip. I think it will be a very upbeat trip overall. I thought I'd talk just very briefly and then turn it over to Steve, and we'll reserve the majority for questions to get in some of the specifics. This trip, I think, probably is well known. This is an opportunity for President Bush to really showcase some of his achievements in Africa. There have been a number of major initiatives launched during his administration, and if you think back 8 years, this was very unexpected from the incoming Bush administration. I think expectations for action on Africa were very low when Bush came to office, but in fact, beginning very early in his tenure and under Secretary of State Colin Powell, you saw almost an immediate launch into greater activism in Africa, first on Sudan in the North-South crisis, but then with some major initiatives, including the Millennium Challenge account, which was announced at in March 2002 at the UN conference in Monterey. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, announced at the State of the Union in January 2003. So this is something of a victory lap, focusing on some of the key partners that the U.S. has had and some of what the administration sees as some of the success stories in Africa. I think there are a couple of audiences here. First, I think the Africa trip, very much like his previous trip in 2003, is presumed to appeal to African American voters, something that initially the Bush administration had very little support in the previous election among the African American community. The 2003 trip was very clearly kind of directed at that, the speech on Gorée Island in Senegal with Condoleezza Rice and Powell at his shoulder. I think, but more broadly, this is to a domestic U.S. audience. It highlights action in Africa, in the developing world. This has been something that I think Democrats have traditionally seen as within their purview, and this is an opportunity to say, to kind of put them on their heels a bit when it comes to that. And then third is, I think, a global demonstration of the U.S. Soft power in the world. Africa is one of the few continents where public opinion towards the U.S. has held fairly steady, although it may be eroding somewhat, but the majority, according to the Pew survey on global attitudes, is that Africans generally still see the U.S. in an overall positive light. The trip goes back, I think, to some of the first pillars some of the pillars of the U.S.-Africa approach that Bush first laid out when he came into office. That is, and this was very important early on, supporting, promoting, and really rewarding those countries who have shown strong progress on democracy, economic development, and so forth. Benin, Ghana, Tanzania, Liberia, all of these have been seen to, and Rwanda, all of these have been seen to have turned a corner. I think the one that probably people will take most exception to is Rwanda, where political space, although the economy has been doing very well and efforts on HIV have been remarkable, the political space and the democratization process has not gone forward, and although this administration continues to view Rwanda in a very positive light. These are also all countries that have been recipients of major U.S. funding flows and partners in security. Rwanda it has been the recipient of PEPFAR, $72 million in 2006, and Steve will talk a little bit more about the PEPFAR initiative as well. Tanzania, a recipient of PEPFAR funding, and there will be the signing of the MCC Global Compact, close to $700 million. This will focus on infrastructure, on water safety, and so forth. Benin, again, a contributor of peacekeeper across the continent, a recipient of $300 million under the MCC, most of which is focused, again, on infrastructure, on port renovation, on the judiciary system. Ghana, a recipient of the MCC of $500 million, seen as a fairly stable and democracy, and also a regional leader in terms of conflict mediation within West Africa and further abroad. Kufuor was one of the leaders who early on went to Nairobi to try to mediate between Raila and Kibaki. And then Liberia, I think, is a particular case. The transition, I think the special relationship with the United States that Liberians probably feel more than the United States does. The U.S. intervention in Liberia in July 2003, which, although many of us saw as coming, was too little, a bit too late, I think Liberians saw as a great breakthrough, and I think Bush's popularity there has remained very high. I was telling Steve there's a popular song in the diaspora here and in Monrovia, you may have heard it, One-Way Ticket to Monrovia, and in the chorus is thank God for ECOWAS and thank God for George Bush. So I think that's a place that he can go to feel very good. Also, a lot has to do with the dynamism and the relationship with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Just a few words about the MCC, which has come under criticism, some of it, I think, driven by partisan politics, some of it because, I think, of the slow dispersal of funds and so forth. In principle, I think the MCC is a very positive development. It is a departure from traditional ways of doing development, which tend to be short-term and funded kind of on a year-by-year basis. MCC is an attempt to move beyond the short term to look longer term and have a longer funding window. Part of the slowness, this is not in defense of the MCC, but part of the slowness, I think, of dispersal comes from the fact that it is countries themselves that determine their needs and negotiate the compact with the United States. And this, again, is a departure. Contrasted with PEPFAR, where the United States really kind of did it themselves in the initial years to get the money flowing quickly, MCC relies more on the partner governments to come forward with their plan, with their proposal, and then negotiate on the basis of that. And that is something different from the usual U.S. way. Third, within PEPFAR, I think this focus on infrastructure. Almost every country that has come forward has had a major focus on infrastructure, physical transportation, communications, electricity, water infrastructure. And that's something that the U.S. and the West generally have not done as much of since the 1970s. You see other partners coming in. China, in particular, has a major focus on infrastructure, and Africans appreciate that very much about the Chinese engagement. And so this is a way, I think, of trying to do things differently in ways that matter to Africans. And then MCC generally is focused on kind of triggering those levers within the country that are going to launch economic growth. It's a very growth-oriented, growth, trade, and investment-oriented initiative. Just to wrap up, I think, again, this is focusing on partners who have been solid, positive partners. I think it's going to be a fairly upbeat trip. I think that's the hope. There are many crises roiling on the continent that will certainly come up. Somalia being one of them, Kenya, continuing conflict in DRC, Darfur, Zimbabwe, which in the last trip that Bush took, he called upon President Mbeki to be kind of the good faith negotiator between the parties in Zimbabwe. We have not seen a lot of progress on that, and that may come back to haunt him in this particular trip. Somalia, likewise. I think in December, Condoleezza Rice went to Addis, and in a 12-hour time span kind of cycled through 3 major intractable conflicts, the DRC, Sudan, and Somalia, sitting in Addis having leaders kind of cycle through, kind of holding court, if you will. I think that was perhaps a way of checking the box on these difficult issues and freeing up Bush to kind of focus on these very positive relationships that they've developed. Anyway, I'll leave it there and turn over to Steve, who can wind up.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us here. I'll add just a few additional comments. First, looking back at the past presidential trips, Clinton did 2 trips in spring of '98 and August of 2000, Bush in July of '03. Generally, there's a preference in these trips, and I think you'll see this, to put the emphasis on things that make you happy, and to avoid talking about things that make you sad. In the spring of '98, it was new leaders. It was Clinton talking about new leaders. There was almost no discussion of HIV/AIDS, and there was almost no discussion of the burgeoning crises in the Great Lakes region and in the Horn of Africa. When we get to this trip and some of the details, there's burgeoning crises near to all of the visits sites, and one of the questions will be, to what degree does the President choose to talk about things that make us all a little uncomfortable or sad? In '03, there was the handoff to Mbeki on Zimbabwe at the very close of the trip, and of course now we're approaching the countdown towards the March elections and what that will mean. And of course Mbeki's achieved, as we can tell right now, has achieved nothing in terms of getting resolution of that. Another thing that cuts across these trips is that they do tend to play to American audiences in a very strong way, and to creation of new images and demonstrate popularity. Clinton got an enormous boost, I think, emotionally and politically from the Ghana visit, where he had 500,000 people. The optics were astonishing. Bush's speech at the close of his trip in Nigeria was a large event that was beamed back to a U.S. audience as a sort of early campaign event. It'd be interesting to see in this trip what happens in Liberia, which is the one site of the 5 where there's, I think, as Jen emphasized, there's a strong case for popular support for President Bush, given the magnitude of change that we've seen in Liberia. Okay, what are going to be the big themes? When you look at Liberia, the big argument's going to be the U.S. made the move beginning in '03, pulled this contributed to pulling, with African regional partners, particularly the Nigerians, pulling this place out of chronic war, ending the war, getting a UN peace operation in on top of the regional intervention, having a transition that resulted in a return to some sort of democratic governance, and now we're consolidating that. The First Lady and the Secretary Rice were there for the inauguration, along with Assistant Secretary Rice. We are very invested in this place, and that's the big argument. The big argument is this is a place, one place in the world that we can point to where the commitments that have been made have shown that pattern of outcomes, and where President Bush remains highly popular. How much? We'll see when we get there. This is Liberia, for its part, is looking for more from us. There's a nervousness in Liberia about the sustainability of this transition, for good reason. Liberia tends to, every 5 years, go down the tubes. And so historical pattern has not been forgotten by anybody that lives or works on Liberia. They very much want to be welcomed in as a threshold country on the MCC. They're not there yet. They won't get there for a couple of years, maybe 1 to 2 years. They very much want AFRICOM to make Liberia its headquarters. And there's been a big push from the President of Liberia to our President. Secretary of State Rice has been lobbying on behalf of this. DOD and the new leadership of AFRICOM are fighting this internally for reasons that we can discuss. I think there may be some compromise position in terms of putting some kind of modest AFRICOM presence into Liberia as a regional presence, because AFRICOM is seeking to create 4 regional offices. But that, I'm not sure how that conflict is being played through, but certainly President Sirleaf Johnson is making a big play for some sort of basing presence in Liberia, and it's tied to anxiety. It's tied to security anxiety about what happens when all the crowds go home, including the UN peacekeepers. What happens when this administration's gone, and are they going to be safe to sort of carry forward? So that's first big theme. Second is global health has graduated into being a mainstream foreign policy priority. It's a huge, and I'll say more about this in a moment, it's a huge and historic, unprecedented play by this administration in terms of PEPFAR and PMI. PEPFAR is the largest single infectious disease campaign in history, and it's predominantly an Africa-focused initiative. PMI is a very impressive and ambitious public health campaign with a predominant focus on Africa. In both cases, the emphasis on PEPFAR and PMI is both to reassure the African audience that these commitments are going to be sustained, and to assuage doubt as we look towards the end of this administration, but also to play back to an American audience about the payback and the value of all of this. And building on what Jennifer said, global health has turned out to be a worthy investment in terms of preserving America's standing in Africa. If you go and look at the Pew Global Attitude Surveys, there was a recent Pew Kaiser Joint Survey, had a number of questions on it. It shows that in Africa, Africa accounts for 8 of the 10 countries in the world where opinion has held, and those are the ones where the biggest investments in global health have been made. Third is on MCC, and I think the MCC, I'll go into some detail in a moment. It's the Tanzania rollout. It's the biggest. It'll be the biggest compact, $698 million. It's an ambitious. It'll be a key event in this trip. There are a number of other countries that figure in MCC, and we'll talk about those in a moment, but it will be celebrating, in a way, the degree to which MCC has emerged and become operational and begun implementation and become a predominantly an African initiative. A U.S. instrument that puts 60 or more % of its resources into Africa, 9 of the 11 compact countries. 6 of the last 7 compact countries have been in Africa. And I'll say a little more about that. Fourth point in thematic is conflict resolution beyond Liberia. This is not a conflict resolution trip. It's coming in the midst of burgeoning crises in Kenya, in the widening arc of crisis in the Horn of Africa, Chad, the Chad-Darfur crisis, the worsening, the tensions in Darfur itself, where there's been limited progress. We can talk more about that. The North-South Peace Accord being in a very fragile condition. The unresolved crisis in Somalia, in which the U.S. is associated in a covert fashion in support of the Ethiopians. There's a broadening arc of crisis in East Africa, in the Horn. It's very much on Tanzania's door. It's very much on the African Union's door. The new leadership of the African Union is President Kikwete of Tanzania. And the Tanzanians, as I'll say a bit more about, Tanzanians are taking hits. They're seeing their port in Mombasa flooded in Dar es Salaam, flooded with redirected traffic They're seeing shortages. They're seeing migration into their territories, including tourists, which are a welcome commercial gain. But they're being called upon at the leadership level to bear a lot of the responsibility for trying to push back, particularly on the Chad and Kenya crises, which are fully on the table there for the African Union leadership. You'll hear a little bit in Rwanda about Rwanda's role in the trying to bring the conflict in the Kivus to ground. There's a recent Goma compact. U.S. has been very engaged in trilateral security negotiations over the last 2 years with DRC, Uganda, and Rwandan defense chiefs. Rwanda is playing ball, it would seem, playing ball with us in drawing down support for Nkunda, the warlord, the Tutsi warlord, who has been the most problematic factor in the Kivus. We'll see if that holds. There'll be a lot more on peacekeeping deployment, particularly into Darfur. But suffice it to say, there are a number of things which are not going to be predominant themes to this trip, but which will surface perhaps in question and answer or in other factors. We've talked about how we're coming into this region beset by crises, but this is not a crisis trip. It is an area where the U.S. has made very substantial diplomatic investments and financial investments, particularly in the Horn of Africa. It's not a trip where there's an emphasis on counterterrorism, on energy, on competition with China. The hard interests, you can make an argument that the U.S. interests in Africa with respect to hard interests have increased dramatically in the last 10 years. Energy dependence, over 21, 22% of imports from Gulf of Guinea. Counterterrorism, huge equities in the Horn and in West Africa. Competition with China has become a much bigger issue. And, of course, transnational infectious disease. So you're not going to see much. On the energy front, you may see some discussion around the new discoveries in Ghana. Ghana and Mauritania are emerging as two new producers in West Africa. Not major big producers, but Ghana now has to face the challenge of managing its oil wealth, and it's a big issue internally there. But there's a lot of buzz in the continent right now, particularly in West Africa with $100 a barrel oil. Exploration is way up off the coast. Liberia, there's lots of exploration off the Liberian coast. And there's been new discoveries that are going to come on stream, particularly Ghana and Mauritania. But it's not going to take away from the big heavy hitters in the region, Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea. On the China piece, China has had the longest standing security relationship in Africa with Tanzania. It dates back to the 60s. It's a strong, lasting relationship. China's presence in the countries that you're visiting has been expanding dramatically. You'll see that in Ghana in a very visible way. It's controversial internally within Ghana, but generally I think it's welcome. You're not going to see a whole lot of emphasis on democracy for obvious reason. This has been a bad phase for democracy in Africa. The Kenya crisis from the December 27th failed elections and was still with us and is not going to be resolved anytime soon and could worsen. The crisis could migrate into Nairobi in terms of interethnic violence. The coast could explode. The mediation efforts that Kikwete, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and others are involved in are going to take a long time to resolve. We've had bad or failed or botched elections in Ethiopia, in Uganda. We had Zimbabwe coming forward in March. We had the stolen elections in April in Nigeria. The DRC elections were not exactly pretty. And Rwanda remains, for all intents and purposes, a minority ethnic regime, which has had some nominal democratic process. We do have, of the 5 countries you're visiting, most of them, all but one, are not subject to any electoral test for some time. Most of them are newly elected or recently elected governments that are credible democracies for the most part, except for Rwanda, but which are not going to have renewed tests. And the exception is Ghana. Ghana has elections at the end of the year, in December. There are 3 main contenders. President Kufuor's nominee did not win the nomination of his own party, be very interesting to see to what degree those three candidates relate to this mission and what they have to say about the prospects. I think generally people are hopeful that the electoral competition in Ghana will go reasonably well and not go the way that we've seen in Kenya. Keep in mind, when this trip was being put together, there was an expectation that Kenya was going to be a big success and that Kenya would figure as part of this trip. So Kenya was on the trip. It was removed for obvious reasons. Uganda was part of the trip at one point and was removed for reasons not unlike those for Kenya. You have other elections or electoral processes in the wing. You've got this transition South Africa into the spring of '09, but it's playing itself through with all of the tensions. On security issues, I did say earlier, Liberia's nervous and pushing for AFRICOM, and that's part of an internal administration debate about where to base AFRICOM or whether to actually commit to a basing. Tanzania is very nervous about Zanzibar. There have been quiet negotiations. There's been, if you go back and look at the history of Tanzania and Zanzibar, there's been very unsatisfying electoral results and efforts at getting negotiations going between Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. The U.S. has attempted to play a quiet mediating role. Hasn't gone anywhere in the last 2 years, but it's an issue that's out there. As I said, Kikwete is getting pulled into the Chad-Kenya crises. Ghana has played a big role in peacekeeping, and it's also one of our partners in the Africa Partnership Station, which is the Gulf of Guinea Maritime Initiative that's ongoing right now. Ghana has been an enthusiastic partner in that. We can talk more about that. That aims to build up Coast Guard capacities in the region, regain control over fisheries, push back on the criminality and piracy in that region. I talked about Rwanda. It's taking hits on oil shortages from the Kenyan crisis. Paul Kagame, President Kagame, you probably noticed last week, took a rather remarkable stand at the African Union Summit in calling for military intervention in Kenya, in saying that it was blatantly clear in his mind that civil institutions were failing, so why not cut to the chase? MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation, it was announced by the President in '02. It went through a difficult, slow startup phase. Mr. Danilovich came in November 5. I think it's fair to say that under Danilovich's leadership, the place got back on its feet and began to accelerate the delivery of new compacts. And we're now in a phase where implementation is beginning to move. It's got 16 compacts if you add Tanzania, totaling $5.5 billion. $3.1 billion is money going to Africa. 9 of the 16 countries are African. There's a lot riding on this for President Bush. This is one of President Bush's initiatives. Congress has not been as cooperative of late. The appropriations for FY08 were $1.544 billion. That was a lot less than the $3 billion request. This year's budget request from this week is $2.225 billion. So the President is pushing. He wants to try. He's being more modest in his request, but he's trying to get Congress to see this in a new way. This trip is going to try to advertise that and make the case. They've done one of the things they face and they're worried about is making sure that the MCC is seen as a worthy foreign aid initiative that has strong bipartisan support and identity. And so they work closely with Congresswoman Lowy. They work closely with Congressman Wolf on the appropriations staff in the House. Senator Leahy has been skeptical but reasonably cooperative. Senator Gregg has been a skeptic. It's a problematic and fragile relationship they have in carrying forward this initiative. And I think this trip, a lot rides on this trip in trying to bring across the achievements and the direction and momentum that things are moving, and trying to bring across that this is a worthy bipartisan initiative and should be carried into the next administration. Senator Obama has taken an official position that he wants an integrated, much more coherent form of foreign aid that would create a DFID-like Department of Foreign Assistance, British-style, cabinet-level, freestanding foreign aid entity if that were created, MCC would be folded into it. Senator Clinton and Senator McCain have taken no positions on this, although I think they've generally been favorable towards MCC. But its future, in a way, hangs in the balance. The trip's going to bring across that this has become a predominantly an Africa initiative, that it's a new model for bringing about assistance, and that it should be carried forward. Liberia, I said, has no program. It's striving to be a threshold country. That's a couple years away. Tanzania is the big new compact. It's going to be focused on road networks, on clean water, and on hydropower. Ghana has a big compact, $547 million 5-year program focused on agricultural productivity. About $10 million has been dispersed. This year there'll be about $50 million dispersed, and next year about $200 million. So they're getting into a sort of liftoff phase. It's predominantly about trying to increase in poorer regions of the country cash and food crop production. Rwanda has not yet signed a threshold agreement. It has one that's in the works at about a $25 to $30 million range, and it's focused predominantly on rule of law, which is the weakest area of governance in the minds of those that are working with them. Benin, there'll be a stopover in Benin. There is a $307 million compact there. It was signed February of 2006. It's had its slow implementation. It's focused on cleaning up the corruption and institutional weaknesses of the port. We'll see what happens. There's another, and they've had some problems of the corruption indicators having slipped in the last year or two, and that's been subject to some renegotiation. On the public health piece, you're going to hear a lot about malaria, and that's interesting because malaria is a recent initiative, really, by comparison with PEPFAR. It's more modest. There's a sense that there are big gains, that it's very cost-effective. I think the argument you're going to hear, if you go and look at the WHO report issued on February 1, which makes the case that the data collected out of Rwanda and Ethiopia show dramatic gains in bringing down malarial infections by the introduction of bed nets and combination therapies and in Ghana, more modest gains, but still significant gains. In Ghana, you know, all of the countries you're going to have some element of the malaria initiative to it, and it's an interesting development, and I think that there's a lot of energy right now within those programs. PEPFAR. As I said, it's a place where, you know, by the end of September, when the first 5-year phase ends in PEPFAR, this September, PEPFAR's first 5-year phase will end. The administration will have spent $18.8 billion on this program. Right now they have 1.4 million people on life-sustaining therapies. They hope to be near their target of 2 million towards the end of this year. I think they're now saying by April of next year they will be at 2 million. 12 of the 15 focus countries are in Africa. You're visiting a couple of these focus countries. This is regarded as historic. It's regarded as something that's had huge payoffs in terms of gains to the sustaining lives of the individuals under threat and of sustaining America's standing. Right now there's a reauthorization debate beginning in the U.S. Congress on this, and it's a very polarized debate, certainly in the House. There was to have been a hearing in the House today. It's been postponed until next week because of the sort of polarization. The White House wants a $30 billion reauthorization for the next 5 years. There's a debate about, is that enough money? Some of the candidates and some of the other Democrats, the Democratic candidates are coming out in favor of $50 billion target. There are a bunch of divisive issues in the reauthorization around abstinence, reproductive health, needle exchange, and there are ongoing debates about whether PEPFAR is too much and too predominant and too exceptional, and whether it's crowding out other worthy health and developmental initiatives, child survival, water, maternal health, family planning. There's also a big debate going on about whether it's too vertical versus whether it should be more horizontal in building up health systems. Don't forget also on this trip to think about and ask about the investments made in the Global Fund. PEPFAR is the predominant piece of the U.S. engagement on HIV/AIDS, and the PMI is the predominant piece on malaria. But keep in mind that we have contributed 1/3 of the Global Fund's $10 billion in grants since it was founded, 2002. And the Global Fund accounts for 2/3 of all international funding for TB and malaria. So the U.S. has had a very profound investment in this period in TB and malaria through multilateral channels. We were the charter investor and political leadership in setting up the Global Fund. The Global Fund gets lost in much of the discussion around global health in Africa, and certainly in the countries you're going to, the Global Fund has been a major partner. And we bear some responsibility and some credit for sort of what has happened in that period. The PEPFAR events are going to be in Tanzania. There'll be an orphans and vulnerable children's event. There'll be something on women in treatment. They're still sorting this out as to what exactly they'll be doing. Thank you very much. Sorry we've gone a bit long.
Steve, Jennifer, thank you so much for the very informative presentation. With that, we'll open it up to questions. And if you could state your name and speak into the microphone and news organization you're with, that would be very helpful. Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Stolberg from the New York Times. And after hearing your presentation, I can't help but wonder if the President is vulnerable to the complaint that he's ignoring a lot of really important issues on this trip. He's going into a continent where there's strife, where we have to compete against China for influence. There's this AFRICOM issue that you mentioned, and yet it seems like none of this is on his agenda. So is he vulnerable to that charge?
Jennifer, you want to take that?
Well, yeah, I think he is, and I think in the last trip. He was in South Africa. The Zimbabwe question confronted him at every turn. He kind of he abdicated some of the responsibility, handing over to Mbeki to be the good faith broker. Meanwhile, Liberia was going to pieces, and bodies were piling up outside the American embassy. And he was able to kind of skirt that and postpone that. And I think that came back as a significant criticism of his trip, that how can you be in Africa kind of promising better cooperation and partnerships when West Africa is crying out for you to do something about the Liberia crisis. And at that time there was a big debate going on between the State Department and the European Command on one hand calling for intervention, and DOD on the other pushing back. And so he kind of postponed that till after the trip, that decision till after the trip. In this case, I think, particularly perhaps in Tanzania, obviously the Kenya crisis, although the administration just announced kind of selected travel bans on some of the hardliners on both sides in Kenya. They haven't released the list, but I think you can make some guesses as to who those are. Obviously Darfur, although that I think he'll receive more criticism back here in the United States than he will from Africans on what's happening in Darfur. But Somalia in particular, and the U.S. action in the Horn, questions about AFRICOM I'm sure will come back. Some of those fears about AFRICOM have been somewhat allayed kind of by one, the ratcheting back of the explanations about what AFRICOM is, and the postponement of the debate about where to base it. Steve talked about Liberia as being one of the big advocates for basing it in Liberia. I think State Department was favoring that option. DOD actually, until fairly recently, was pushing for Kenya. But just the politics of that, I think AFRICOM has fairly successfully said, look, we're based in Stuttgart until further notice. And so that may not come up. But the concept of AFRICOM particularly among civil society groups, I think is still going to come up. And then obviously the Somalia and the Horn issues, and U.S. interventions there, kind of the heavy focus on counterterrorism to the exclusion of kind of a broader approach. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Well, I think I'm not very good at sound bites, am I?
That's for a soundbite, but if you can sort of give us just one overarching
Right.
question that he faces
Well,
on the trip.
I think some of the U.S. hard interests will come back again and again. The kind of the quest for energy, counterterrorism initiatives, competition with the Chinese. Those are the issues, and the U.S. focus on those in the broad approach, I think, may come back as criticisms of the United States, and the lack of investment, although the administration would dispute that, on conflict resolution mechanisms, investments.
May I add to that? It's inevitable that they're, particularly in Tanzania, in being in Tanzania and engaging with President Kikwete, it's inevitable that you're going to talk about this crisis, the crisis within Kenya and the broader Horn. I think you could make the same argument in Ghana, where President Kufuor was just the head of the AU. He's just retired, and he was deeply engaged in the early phase of the Kenyan crisis. Right? He was, and Kagame in Rwanda. He is going to countries where the leadership has taken or is positioned to be very much front and center in making decisions. So on this. And the second point is, it's not as if the administration is disengaged on some of these crisis areas. It's just this trip is designed with a different kind of focus. And by that I mean, when you look at the different moving parts in the Sudan or broader Horn crisis, there's a lot of intense engagement by this administration. Rich Williamson has just been appointed as the new envoy on Sudan. The administration is deeply involved in trying to move forward the AU-UN peace deployment into Darfur, and has been coordinating at the African summit with the Chinese counterparts, British, French, and others, in trying to push Bashir on this. So it's not as if there's a disengagement. It's rather a question of not preferring to make these really tough, complex crises the centerpiece of the trip, but it's unavoidable that they're going to have to talk about this.
I think he'll be downplaying some of the hard power interventions, which tend to be the more controversial, and really focusing on these soft power good news stories. And so that, yes, that may come back as criticism. But
on the AFRICOM piece, they got themselves into trouble in standing up AFRICOM before October 1, when General Ward became the commander-in-chief, and it began its first transitional year. They got themselves into trouble by announcing that they were going to make decisions on basing on both the headquarters and regional presences in the first year, and that ignited a very negative and strong reaction across the continent. They've walked back from that. Admiral Mueller had the number two, one of the two number twos to General Ward, made a statement out of Stuttgart last week, pretty much saying, we're putting on the shelf the basing issue. They're now in a quiet phase where they're trying to build up their credibility in their consultations and actually get on with some of the work that they're supposed to be doing in terms of building peacekeeping capacity and training and maritime security initiatives and the like. In that respect, I think being quiet and just getting on with their work is what they need to do to sort of build their case, not make this a big feature of this trip. Now, the Liberia dimension is the open question on whether that is something where the pressure builds to do something public and to make some kind of basing commitment. And I'm not sure how it's going to play itself through.
Howard LaFranchi with the Christian Science Monitor. On the MCC, you talked about slow implementation and then countries where things are sort of starting to get going. Is there any place where the President will be able to focus on, accomplishments and sort of zero in on, this is what this initiative has done, so that either he can, with Congress or just generally the American people, he can point to, this is what's happening, not this is what this is designed to do in the future?
Actually, on this trip, Ghana and Benin were both signed in 2006. I imagine that there may be some pilot-type project that can be showcased, but I don't know if it's. I think it's still too early to show kind of broad, demonstrable progress on any of these.
No, the startup of these big compacts has been quite slow. These are large, complex infrastructure projects. They require a lot of financial and engineering studies and contractual arrangements, and the disbursement rates have been very slow. And that's been something that they've come under criticism and pressure from Congress on that. So the short answer is no. There's not much. It's not as if they can go to Ghana or Benin and walk out and say, okay, the first $100 million has been disbursed to create X. There'll be an opportunity to go around and see what the port looks like in Benin, or what they could. But I don't think it's the focus is going to be things are moving forward, and we're on the edge of finally getting to the point where the disbursements are going to begin in the next year, and 2 years, 3 years out, to accelerate dramatically. And in the case of Tanzania, here's a big new package that's going to be signed and moving forward. And be patient, and this is a valid process, and we're moving ahead. But they won't be able to bring showcase models forward and say, okay, here's what you get. We're a couple of years short of that, which is obviously a little bit of a problem, but.
Hi, Ben Feller with the Associated Press. 2 questions about aid to the region. The first is, you commented earlier about how this trip could play to an American audience. I'm wondering, is there clear evidence that this kind of investment in Africa, particularly on health issues, but also infrastructure, matters to the American people? Is this something that, at a time when people are worried about their own welfare and economics, that a trip highlighting global health investments is going to be well received, is going to resonate?
There has been a lot of survey work of American opinion in the last couple of years around this issue of foreign aid that goes towards public health. And it's shown that a strong receptivity to higher levels of engagement by the United States. And it may be that it's a somewhat shallow shift or a shallow sentiment that could change if there were a sudden worsening of our economic circumstances. But this is an area that resonates. The global public health is something that resonates with the American people in a surprisingly positive way, and it's helped turn around some of the accepted wisdom around foreign aid being a political loser as an issue politically. And I think it's one of the reasons why you've had such strong bipartisan support within Congress for program as dramatic as PEPFAR. So it's paid off. And there are other ways in which, when you look at the constituencies that have gathered around global public health, you begin to understand it. I mean, you have new actors that are American societal interests that are deeply engaged in this and are vocal and matter to the American public, right? You have new advocate groups like the One Campaign, Data One Campaign that recently emerged, and new celebrity advocates. You have new foundation powers, like the Clinton Foundation or the Gates Foundation. You have the religious conservative community very engaged. You have over 24 public health graduate programs in the United States that now have dedicated global health programs. You have a burgeoning of undergraduates and graduate students across the United States going into global public health programs. The numbers are just off the charts. You have a general, I think, among youth opinion towards some form of altruism, and this has been a very, this has been a very attractive focus for a more general sensibility of wanting to do good in the world and be seen that way. And it's captured a lot of opinion in that regard. So I think there's a lot of positives that push in the American society towards this. It's hard to find an operational non-governmental organization in the United States, large, that's not doing lots of work in health now. It's hard to go to a medical school in the United States and not find a lot of excitement among faculty and researchers who are doing overseas and Africa-centered work, either on the research side or on operational delivery of programs. Institute of Medicine is just starting up a big study right now on America's vital interests in global health. A big, ambitious study that follows the study that they did reviewing PEPFAR. They did a big study last year on PEPFAR that was a very strong affirmation of PEPFAR, and it was drawn from a broad and very esteemed group of medical and public health experts, both American and non-American, who were very skeptical when they came into this process because they had not been at the table when the program was designed and birthed. But they came around and embraced this in a 500-page analysis. So you can point to a bunch of different entry points that show that something's changing, and the investments that have been made in global public health in Africa touch the lives of lots of Americans. They're not remote. And they're changing the calculation of students going to what they choose to focus on. It's changing the calculations of non-governmental groups and foundations and religious groups and the like. And it's not insignificant. And we don't fully understand the magnitude of this. The broader opinion survey stuff is positive but shallow. It could reverse. We don't know at what's the tipping point where American opinion or opinion in Congress might say $30 billion for the next 5 years, great, go for it. President's got it, hit it right. $50 billion, that's a bridge too far. We've got too many other competing priorities, including domestic and other international priorities. We don't know. That debate has not happened yet.
Just a quick follow on that. Could you elaborate on the historical context of PEPFAR? Is it historic and unprecedented for this president, for any president?
It's the single largest infectious disease campaign in the history of the world. I mean, in dollar terms, it exceeds, smallpox, polio, in dollar terms. And it's important to remember this administration was not expected to embark on this. This was a big surprise. And it didn't enter office thinking this is going to be one of its strategic plays. And you could actually argue that it was, twin of Iraq in a way.
Wendell Goler with Fox. You've said that some of the criticism of the slow dispersal on the Millennium Challenge Compact is political. Some, I think you suggested, was based on the leadership of the program before it changed in 2005. I wonder if you can quantify how much for each, and if you can tell me how significant the change in administrations would be if this program is changed or not continued as the President sees it.
The roots of the delay or frustration around it, I mean, one is just the design of this program. This MCC was a brand new concept. It was a new model. The institution didn't exist. The institution had to be built. It wasn't like PEPFAR. PEPFAR they created the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, but they had aid missions and CDC shops, USAID missions and CDC shops and embassies that could be the the sort of fulcrum in the 15 focus countries. In PEPFAR, they had to sort of begin to create things from new cloth, and that and it was a model that was calling for the countries themselves to put the proposals forward. They didn't control the pace at which they might be able to do that and produce credible programs. It was announced in 2002 and then got lost in the White House, and there was in the first phase of the Iraq War, it was slow to get organized, and Paul Applegarth did not get appointed until June of 2004 as the first head, and he was slow to sort of get things rolling, and then he was replaced in, what did I say, November of 2005 by Danilovich. So it had a bumpy start. It was inherently going to be slow, and it's an infrastructure project. It's not micro projects. It's not NGO implementers. It's large infrastructure, complex infrastructure projects, and with a view that these have to be carefully planned out as they move forward. So it has a certain amount of vulnerability, I think, built into it politically, that people are going to grow impatient with, well, okay, when are we going to see the results of this? 5.5 billion in 16 countries. Where can you point to where, we're now in year, we're now in year 6, and we're still looking for the proof of the model and the concept. And the answer to that is not quite yet. We're confident that things are moving ahead in a number of worthy projects, but you're going to have to wait another year or two to begin to really see the stuff coming out of the ground that's going to show you that, demonstrate the proof of concept. Jen?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think the criticism is being entirely partisan or political. I think a lot of it just reflects the bias for kind of quick results and quick dispersal and proof, which, as Steve said, in this case, I think part of the strength of the MCC is that it is looking longer term, and it does take longer planning. Contrast that with PEPFAR, where there was such a push, particularly in the first 2 years, to get people quickly on treatment so that you could come back to Congress and say, look, we've got X number of people on treatment. That's something that you can see, it's lives being saved, and so forth. The criticism of PEPFAR has been, well, all very well, it's all very well. It's a good thing to get these people on treatment, but you've neglected the long-term sustainability issues and building the systems that are going to last these countries beyond, PEPFAR's phase. And so there are two examples of different ways of doing business. PEPFAR, the quick results, I think, is going to be more appealing to a Congress. And when they're looking for things to cut, if the budget is tight, I think MCC, it's not, you don't see that tangible life-saving result.